Hi, my name's Zach Varda, and today on the Student Slant, we talked to co-host Jake Rahe and assistant campus editor Owen Daugherty about their research article.
So I was reading an interesting article over the fall from The Atlantic, and it was highlighting how important research is to the Midwest economy, specifically with public institutions conducting so much research. They get so much funding, and then it attracts jobs and it starts companies that normally stay regional. So specifically for the Midwest, big college research is so important, and the federal government recently has been really scaling back how much they're willing to fund research, and it made me interested to look into how much Ohio State gets its research funded from the federal government. And my name's Owen Daugherty, and I'm the assistant campus editor at the Lantern.
I'm Jake Rahe.
I'm Zach Varda, and this is the Student Slant. So both of you worked on this actually. I know Owen handled more of the data-driven, and Jake, you were more of like the anecdotal because you talked a lot to researchers. So I'm kind of wondering for both of you what it was like kind of coming together and working on this, and just kind of what you took away from working on this article.
It was cool. I definitely felt it was important to get Jake involved. Last semester, he was the research and kind of tech reporter for the Lantern, and it's something that he likes to read about and is knowledgeable about. So I think over the course of the semester, you probably interviewed 8 to 12 different researchers, and there's some consistencies and some patterns you noticed. And then I was looking at some data trends, and over the last 5 or 6 years, Ohio State has been extremely stagnant in the amount of federal funding it's gotten from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health, which, according to the vice president of research here at Ohio State, Carol Whitaker, that's about 75% of their funding, down from 85% in the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years. So they're just diversifying and looking for different ways to get funding, and I thought that was interesting to do a story about, and I thought Jake had really good insight into how that's impacting professors doing research.
Yeah, for me, the experience was really cool because Owen came to me with the story, and I liked it a lot at first, and I wanted to be part of it, but I didn't know really where my role would play in because when he was coming to me with it, it was more of the data-driven, and I read the Atlantic article as well, and coming in with the data and all of this kind of Midwestern issue economically and universities having trouble. I wasn't really sure where my tech and research articles would come in from a funding standpoint because I didn't really think about all of that much, and it wasn't coming up as much when he first approached me about the article in like my interviews. But after he approached me with it, I started to sort of hear the researchers and instructors mention it in their interviews, and it would come up just naturally from them, and you could tell they were really concerned. And at first, when we were writing the article, it didn't really seem to mesh at first. I had some anecdotal insight, but I hadn't really looked at my quotes really deeply. But as we were writing in the process, like we started to come together and really put my quotes to the facts that he had. It matched up so perfectly and just really started to click. And it was a really cool experience in that aspect because I had never written an article with someone else before. So coming into it, I wasn't really sure. And then seeing that like work together so perfectly from an anecdotal standpoint, from researchers actually speaking their concerns, and then data backing that up with the quotes backing the data up as well. It was just really cool.
Oh, and you mentioned how they're trying to diversify funding now with the downgrade in the amount of funding they're getting federally. What are some of the ways Ohio State specifically is trying to diversify funding, and maybe how does that compare to other universities in the Midwest?
Yeah, the cool thing about something like this, when it is federal funding that you're looking at, a lot of it's just available, not even through public records. It's available online databases. You can get different spreadsheets. You can punch in different keys if you're looking for engineering funding or science fund or health funding, stuff like that. So it's not that Ohio State is getting significantly less. It's actually very stagnant. It's that when it's the same over an extended period of time with inflation taken into account, and let's say another school is getting more, like a private institution, Ohio State will fall behind. So they've really dropped in their rankings more so than they have in their funding. That's a result of stagnant funding and private institutions taking faculty and personnel and facilities just costing more. So that's a fact of reality. So Ohio State is, I would say, pretty forward thinking in this. They open an office to help researchers and professors write better grant proposals to have a higher success rate of getting their proposals accepted and funded. And then they've also branched out by really philanthropy, private fundraising. They had a huge But for Ohio State campaign that lasted about 6 years. $1 billion was raised for research that was all going to stay here on campus. That went to new facilities, funding new projects, and hiring and retaining staff and faculty, which is really where it all starts. That means more graduate students are getting research projects that they can work on, and more graduate students are able to stay around after they graduate or to do their next step of education at Ohio State because they are tied to a senior researcher or principal investigator. And then Ohio State's also taken some pretty big, I wouldn't really call it donations because they're kind of symbiotic relationships, but industry-driven research is huge with people like Honda, Coca-Cola, Dow Chemical, Battelle. These are huge companies that might not have the facilities or the wherewithal to do the research themselves, but are interested in funding this research, whether it be for the greater good or maybe their own private interest. But regardless, it's becoming a bigger piece of the pie at Ohio State. So those are a few different ways they're branching out.
Zach, you asked me about how like my quotes were more of the anecdotal part of the article, but at the same time, Owen had quotes from very large, influential people at Ohio State. And how do you feel like the quotes from Dr. Drake, the president of the university, and Carol Whitaker, the president of the Office of Research, how do you feel like that enhanced the article to bring it from a administrative standpoint and a researcher standpoint, and how that kind of played in the article?
For one, I think Dr. Drake is actually surprisingly easy to talk to and willing to veer off on different topics. And people forget that also he has a huge medical background. He was actually in charge of the medical operations and systems. I'm not exactly sure what his title was at California State Colleges. So he oversaw huge projects, several different campuses and stuff like that. So that's actually some of his expertise. So when we were talking about him hiring a new chancellor, he kept bringing up how this new chancellor needs to oversee so many different things and how driving research funding is going to be an important task of this new chancellor because you're bringing about the Wexner Medical Center, research institutes, James Cancer Hospital, all under one umbrella, one leadership. He's going to have to know how to help his doctors and researchers get grants funded. And also he's going to be huge in shaking hands and talking to people and driving that outside fundraising and private and corporate donations that Ohio State's really ramping up in recent years. So he brought that up and we started talking about that, and Drake knows how important research funding is. So he gave some great quotes on that and was very open about Ohio State's ideas and not necessarily struggles, but really what they're looking into to combat that problem that's kind of happening on a national level where that federal funding is decreasing or at least stagnant. And then Dr. Whitaker has been in Ohio State for 36 years. She knows it all. She's seen it all. As the VP of research for the last 10 years, she's just tried to put new ideas in place that will help, like I said, with that grant proposal office and just really working those connections and getting local businesses involved.
Jake, you talked about how as the article moved along, as it developed, you saw what you were hearing from researchers lining up with what the data was showing. And I know there was one professor in particular, or researcher in particular, who you got some really good quotes for and who had some really good insights. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was Mark Falia. He is a human nutrition researcher at Ohio State. Originally, I was writing an article about his research on golden potatoes and how they're high in vitamin A and E, and to help different countries who may be malnourished that typically eat potatoes find a way to get those nutrients. And we had about a 45-minute conversation about that. And then he sort of went from talking about potatoes to talking about about the lab, and then he just mentioned survival and how without grant funding you can't do research. And I mentioned to him that, oh yeah, I'm actually looking to write an article about research funding at Ohio State, and he got very involved and very excited about talking about how they're struggling to find grant money and how it's affecting different aspects of the lab, of how many researchers writing proposals 50% of the time instead of being in the lab teaching undergrads and postdocs and graduates students how to do the things they need to do in the lab to do it properly, and how it's not just having an effect on the type of research they can do, but researchers in the future, and that this pullback on funding is really having an effect for the future, not just right now.
So I'm going to veer slightly off track here for a second and take a step back, because part of what we do in this podcast is to talk about student journalism issues and learning to be a journalist. This to me sounds like an interviewing technique. Was this a situation where just maybe sitting back and letting someone talk and not cutting them off paid dividends?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we end the article with his out of nowhere random quote saying survival without grant funding, you can't do research. So, yeah, it was really just spur of the moment. He mentioned that, and then I just mentioned that I was writing the article, and he talked on his own for about 10 minutes, and I didn't have to say a word. I just let him keep going and keep going. So, yeah, I would say that using that technique was definitely beneficial for this interview.
Along the same lines, Owen, I'm wondering, dealing with all this data, I know you've done a few stories in your time dealing with data, and you're pretty good at it. But what's it like kind of really diving into the numbers on a story, and maybe how do you keep from your head spinning when you're just going through, numbers after numbers after numbers?
This one wasn't it wasn't terribly bad. You could get really into the nitty-gritty into each different department that funding's getting, how many different awards and people are getting funded by each. But I think for this it was actually more telling to look at overall trends over 10, even 20 years of where's the funding coming from in big numbers. Not to each doctor. I'm talking about to Ohio State as a whole. So there you're only looking at like 3 federal institutions, and each year for me it really helps to write them down. So at one point I just had on in my notebook 10 different years written down from 3 different institutions, and writing them down makes it easier to remember and kind of easier to look at and look at more critically. And from there, trends are very clear, and these are national trends. Ohio State doesn't really buck them in any way. They follow them pretty consistently, where you just have to look outside the box for new areas of funding because the federal is just not there. It's just falling flat. So in that regard, the data wasn't too intensive or heavy. It's just instead of looking at one outlier, you're looking at a trend. And I think the data speaks for itself when you see, even if it's $1 billion that Ohio State's gotten, if it's $1 billion for the last 10 years, there's no increase. We're looking at a 3% potentially inflation rate each year. That number, it just has less purchasing power. It has less funding power. And when you're talking about graduate students and postdocs doing their first research project and then wanting to move on into bigger, better things, you have to pay them. You have to fund them.
So the day this podcast comes out, this episode comes out, your article will be coming out the same day. I know, Owen, this is more something you've done a few times. Jake, this is your first time. Kind of just wondering your thoughts on working on something for an extended period of time, month and a half, and then finally getting to see it be complete and go out to the readers.
I mean, bluntly, I guess I'm excited. It was a lot of work. We kind of took a step away from it for a little bit because we went on winter break. It probably would have been out, I'd say 2 weeks if it wouldn't have been in the way it fell. But yeah, I mean, it's exciting that it's finally getting to come out. I'm hoping it actually has good readership, and I know Wyatt contacted our communications associate director, Ben Johnson. Yeah, the associate director, Ben Johnson, just to let him know the story was coming out. And I've actually never had a story where I've actually had to contact Ohio State's communication department to let them know a story's coming out about some of the things that they might not like. I mean, there wasn't anything negative really about what anyone said or how the article's written or anything like that, but it was interesting to me that we just had to let them know that there could be some sort of issue taken with what's inside the article. What do you think, Owen?
Yeah, definitely. It would have been sooner. We chilled on Christmas break. Pumped the brakes a little bit. So, the Lantern did much less content, and I think all of us enjoyed a little bit of a break. And then, coming into this semester, the timing of it was key because it's by no means breaking news. It took us a little bit of time, but I think it's great to have stories like these where there isn't anything that's going to lead a paper or drive content the next day, but it's not evergreen in a way, but you know, it's something you can take your time on and be like, we want to put it out this date because this is when it makes the most sense. So it'll be nice to take a step back and read it in print. And you know, with giving Ohio State a fair shake to comment, that's just, I think, for us as student journalists, it's doing everything the right way and going about the steps that you need to take in terms of, hey Ben, I really appreciate you setting up these interviews. You know, obviously what was said in the interviews you set up. We were also doing our own reporting with researchers and professors, getting their firsthand experience. Here's how that matches up and compares and contrasts with what, you know, Carol Whitaker and Dr. Drake told us. And they're not battling each other. They're under one roof. They're actually on the same team. There's no big bad guy in this. It's just the sobering reality of what's going on and the struggles that researchers are going through to do their work. So, you know, calling Ben and letting him know that was just what we try to do to strengthen that relationship. They come into the class and tell you how they're always ready for a phone call and always want to help. And I think they mean that. And this is us doing that back to them.
Thanks for joining us for another great discussion. Join us next week for more student perspective on the Student Slant.